Next slide. This is another typical collapse. This one you can see has a void in it. This is the type of building that the American USAR teams and the foreign USAR teams would have gone and tried to make some kind of entry and rescue. But I'm sure you heard on the news that there weren't a lot of rescues in comparison to the amount of people that perished. Next slide. This gentleman was, he was called JB. It was short for some long French name, but when he was 1 year old, he was sacrificed to Satan on an altar of fire. And some lady grabbed him and ran and saved his life, literally. He had a lot of burn scars on him, but he's now walking strongly for the Lord. So the Lord obviously had a use for him. But this was at the... it's kind of confusing because there were two ministries with similar names. The first team worked with a ministry called Light Ministries, which was an organization that was closely affiliated with YWAM and World Vision, and they were church planting people. And they were running a clinic out of their church, and that's where a lot of our guys got involved. And that's where this particular picture was taken. It was behind their compound. Next slide. And this was just outside of that church, and it's in Carrefour, which a lot of the Haitian community of Port-au-Prince, the districts were kind of like suburbs of Los Angeles, for lack of better words, but they named them by streets, and this was the street Care and then the number 4, so it was Carrefour. But it was one of the very poorest sections of Port-au-Prince, and this was a typical street where you could just see people doing a lot of their business and out and about, taking care of daily needs, living out on the streets. Next slide. These were people that were lined up for a clinic at Light Ministries. There were three. Our team kind of split up. We had 12 people, and the ones who were more medically qualified, we had a paramedic and a nurse, and a fireman who'd been a fireman his whole career, so his EMT skills were up. They went down to the tent hospital and worked down there. And then myself, John White, and a gal on our team who was an EMT, Ava, who just got her EMT license, went to this little clinic, which was just dealing with sick people. They had a couple of internists that were missionaries from the Maryland area there, and then a couple of nurses, and then we went just to help them out. And so you can go to the next slide. This was a girl that was waiting for pharmacist Jeff to prescribe medication for her. I got a 5-minute indoctrination into how to be a pharmacist, because that's what I was doing. I was dispensing medicines for people, and that was a challenge. But anyway, she was waiting, and I couldn't help but pass up this picture. She was so cute. Next slide. And that's the pharmacy. So that's what we're dealing with. And I would be standing back there with these people, and they would hand me a prescription, and I have to decipher the chicken scratch of the physician and then try to find out what medicine it was, which a lot of those were from foreign countries. So I was relying a lot on these Haitian girls who could read the chicken scratch because they'd been doing it for a long time. And this nurse Nancy here. So next slide. And John, he originally, when he got there, was stocking shelves upstairs. But then when he finished what he was doing, he took opportunity, and John White is quite the evangelist. He's the president of Firefighters for Christ. He's a young man of 76 that will work circles around most guys half his age, but whenever there's an opportunity to minister, he will do it. If you look closely in his left hand there's a syringe, and it's filled with olive oil. So he was going around anointing all these patients that were waiting to be treated with olive oil. Next slide. This is called a tap-tap. I don't know if you guys were following some of the emails and updates on the website, but this was the type of vehicle that the first team retained for a week because they were using it to transport people that were coming into their clinic that were more seriously hurt down to the tent hospital by the palace. And this is a typical taxi. There's thousands of them going around the city, and they'll take whatever little truck they can find, stick that colorful shell on it, and build bench seats and hold 30 people in there. And that's the taxis. Next slide. This was just another typical building collapse. And as you can see, there's rebar in these buildings, so you would think that they would be sturdy enough, but most of these homes are not built on any kind of foundation, and the materials that they use weren't hard. The rebar, a lot of it was just pencil wire or pencil bar. It didn't have a lot of coarseness to it, and then the concrete and the blocks were so soft and crumbly due to lack of lime or quality materials that they just crumbled. Next slide. This was the palace. Believe it or not, this was built by Americans way back when, but it didn't survive as well. It pretty much will have to be totally destroyed. Next slide. This is the living conditions of the average Haitian before the earthquake, and as you can see, they're not very good, and just people are actually still in there trying to collect goods and living there. You can see clothes hanging out and things like that, but it's a very, very poor country. Next slide. This is a gentleman who was one of the orphans, one of the older orphans, and his name was Edison, and he had some carpentry skills. He had been to school, but he basically learned how to use hand tools. And so he was real interested in helping our team members work and build these benches or desks that they were building. And so they were teaching him because they knew they probably weren't going to finish. And so he was learning really fast how to use the power tools, because the lumber that we got, a lot of it was kind of rough sawn and would have been difficult and given kids a lot of splinters. So we had to plane the wood and use a router to round the sides. So there was a lot of prep work, and they were kind of doing an assembly line here. But he was very, very helpful. Next slide. And you can see the assembly line that they're doing. They're just getting all the wood ready to go, and then they had everything cut, and then the last part was just putting everything together. And we did complete about 20 of those. This gal here, her name is Arianis. Be praying for her. The reason that we were even in this facility was a vision that she had when she was 9 years old. Her family had adopted through an organization like World Vision a child from Haiti, and we're sponsoring that child. And she was very fervent in her prayers. And throughout the course of praying for this child, she had a vision that she would someday be a full-time missionary down there and build a hospital, a school, and an orphanage for these kids. And she's 17 in this picture, but 3/4 of her vision has already come true. And through the course of all of this, well, by the time she was 11, was the first time that she and her parents went down to Haiti to visit the child that they were supporting. And she stepped off the plane and said, "I'm home." And this is an 11-year-old girl. And so she's really got a heart for the Lord. And her parents eventually ended up pulling up root and moving down there. About a year or so later, they've been down there for 5 years, 6 years, I believe. Next slide. This is the boys' orphanage. The way the neighborhood was situated, the Manaceros, which were her parents, lived up the street, and then down the street was the girls' orphanage on the same side. Next door to that was the guest/office where we stayed. Across the street was the boys' orphanage, and then around the corner was a building they just recently acquired where we were building those desks that were going to be used for the school, and then across the street from that was the lot where we were going to build the tent shelter. And these are just some of the boys playing activities. They had like a little field out in their property there. Next slide. This was the youngest gal that was in the orphanage. She was 2 years old. And then the other girl whose lap she's sitting in was the other daughter of the Manaceros. And this was a soccer championship that the orphan boys were playing. They were to the final game. And so they were having a lot of fun. Next slide.